Peace and blessings, soul family. Adam Jackson here with another episode of the Sacred Sons podcast. Sacred Sons, we're going to get deep today. We're going to get hearts deep. We're going to drop the voice an octave because our brother Erick Godsey is in the house with us today. Welcome, Erick.
Thank you for having us, brother.
Yeah, man. And Sacred Sons, you know, we've been thinking a lot about how do we say what it is that we do in a concise way that everyone can just understand.
Yeah.
And so this is what we've come up with. We are helping to connect men to their hearts. It's in its simplest form. We do so many things, truly, but in its simplest form, Sacred Sons is here to help connect men to their hearts. So if you're someone who is potentially on that journey right now from head to heart, and we know as men, sometimes this is the hardest journey there is.
Yeah.
To get out of our head, into our bodies, into our hearts, to lead from our hearts. We have a global EMX event coming up December 1st through 4th. I will be leading EMX SAN DIEGO alongside my brother Vince Matoska Chafin. That's in San Diego at the same time, same weekend, all the way across the globe. Devon, UK, that's outside of London. All my European brothers get to Devon for EMX led by my brother Kale Kahi, Jason McKenzie, and Andrew Huvar. This is what we're about, fam. Doing the men's work in alignment, connecting to our hearts in some form of a global masculine alchemy meditation. If you are interested, please go to sacredsons.com, click on EMX and register today. All right.
And so
and
cool
with that,
we're doing those at the same time. That's a great idea.
Dude, it's like our demographic is half of the human beings on planet Earth.
Let's go.
And so this is not a movement that's held by any one man. There's no, in our case, there's no man behind the curtain. We are a real community of men who are committed to leading in our own lives and to helping our brothers connect to their hearts. And, you know, we're going to talk a lot about today. I'm just going to go ahead and intro you. With that, our guest today, he is the host of the Myths That Make Us podcast. He's a founding coach of Fit for Service. He's a lover and a warrior. And his focus is on co-creating a new psychology that can meet our planet's existential crisis. That's a tall order. Please welcome Erick Godsey.
Thank you for having me, brother. And that was a hell of an intro. And I love your vibe.
Thank you for being here, bro. You know, this is our first time meeting. And so I know you're in the work. You're doing similar things. We have the practices, we have the modalities. You're a founding coach, as I mentioned, of Fit for Service. What are you seeing out there? What are you seeing in the community that needs our service right now?
For me specifically, what I'm seeing is a repression of grief and shame as one of the hallmarks of, so I'll frame it like this. I've been studying psychology for about 12 or 13 years. I read a lot, and I hadn't read a single book or ever had a period in my life where I deeply contemplated shame. And for this most recent Fit for Service event we did, my friend asked me to read this essay on shame and to potentially do a workshop on shame. And as I started to read this, it blew my mind, where by the time I got through this essay, I realized that shame was one of the most important aspects of the illness that I see in our culture. And one of the things that the essay said is that the nature of shame is to conceal itself from you. And I was like, oh, that's why I've never fucking, in 12 years of study, I've never really sat with it. And just to give you a quick orientation of the frame that I have for like the human condition is I'm really big and a big fan of Carl Jung. And one of his core beliefs about the human psyche is that the proper metaphor for it is nature. And that his favorite example was the acorn and the oak tree. And that there is a living intelligence inside of the seed that knows what it's meant to be. And, you know, we could debate on what know means, but there's something inside of it that has a structural intelligence that weaves its biology to become a tree. Every living creature on some level has that. And yet humans are the only animal that has the capability of stunting that within itself.
Or separating itself from.
Right. And that I think the core emotion that's able to stunt the living intelligence inside of us that knows what we're meant to become is shame. Fundamentally, it's shame.
Yeah.
And that like shame is the essence of our oldest story in Western culture, which is, you know, the story of the Garden of Eden. And so I did this.
I think that's an important piece to note in Western culture.
100%.
Because in many indigenous cultures, they don't really have a conception of shame or practices around it.
And they also don't have the same type of inhibition around death and like
And
we
life.
are a culture. Right.
And life, black and white.
100%. And that for me, like there's something about my internal makeup with the family dynamics that I had growing up where my unique gift is to be able to see people's grief and shame like the moment I meet them, and that it's been one of the tasks of my adult life to develop grace with how bluntly I bring their attention to it. There's this idea, there's an idea in psychotherapy where if you reveal their wound for them, you actually rob them of the gifts that they would receive if they found it on their own. And that's so what a very adept psychotherapist will do is they reflect in a way that helps the other person discover it themselves. And when I was young, I did not have that grace. And I've hurt people in my life because it was like a gift I didn't know how to use. And so,
I mean,
long story short,
what would be a good mythological metaphor? Like Cyclops without the glasses energy.
That's a
you
really
know what I'm saying?
one.
Like, like you have this amazing power that can be a creative force or a destructive force.
Yeah.
And until it's harnessed, until we have mentorship, or in this case, you know, you're speaking to psychological therapy, Western therapy. Yeah. It's like it's having that superpower without being able to harness it.
Yeah. And there's another mythological motif where it's if a god would reveal their true form to a mortal, the mortal would burst into flames. And I think that each of our higher selves, like each of us have this knowing in the privacy of our own heart of the man or the woman that we could be. And there's this weird thing where the more clearly we know what we could be, the more tension we feel with where we are now. And there's this really interesting thing that happens in kind of the spiritual community where in order to heal from a lot of the gaslighting and the pain that Western culture has created in us, we've overcompensated by saying that you're okay just the way you are. And that's partial but incomplete. There is no shame for who you are, but there is also a responsibility and a calling. And I really want to give the ball back to you so this can be a back and forth, but just real quick, the one other thing that I love is I believe that force inside of the seed that knows what it could be, I like to call it the daemon. And that's
Yeah.
a Greek word for like this inner guardian spirit that actually knows what your quote unquote fate, or knows what you could be, and it whispers to you. And that a daemon denied becomes a demon. And I think that the word demon etymologically grew out of daemon, and it was put forth by the monotheistic religions.
Yes.
I think that it was like one of the major gaslightings in history, that the daemon was converted to a demon, because if you're connected to your daemon, the priest has no power. And so ultimately, I'm trying to help people learn how to interact and connect with their daemon, because I think that's the ultimate psychotherapist, is their daemon.
At this point, I just want to ask you, do you believe that psychology is the gateway? Is it the key? Because there's a part of me as well that acknowledges in the natural ecosystem that we are as humanity, the village is missing, the connection is missing. Individual psychology cannot be the cure for humanity, right? So how are you connecting this through Fit for Service, through community, through your studies? How can we connect this individual psychology to collective psychology, to co-creating, you know, that new hive mind that really can meet the challenges that we're facing?
Yeah. Yeah, I think at its core, I actually identify as a storyteller first. And one of the uh, acts that I play is psychologist. And that I think that, like, in the same way that most people in the West are so disconnected from their hearts, that I recommend journaling first so that they can get still enough where they can actually learn how to meditate. Whereas people who aren't wounded by Western culture can just start with being present. I think that as a bridge, because I am a child of Western culture. I am a
Yeah,
child
of
of this
course.
empire consciousness that I think is ultimately destroying the world. And it's like a part of me being honest to who I am is to accept the tragedy that I am a child of this fatherly spirit that has wounded me and all my brothers and sisters in a way
Yeah,
where I'm not resentful, but I'm trying to improve it. And that in order for me to meet my people where they're at, I think like, if you imagine you're creating a bridge, the like first 10 feet of the bridge from the landmass that we're on, it's like Western psychology. But then
yeah,
the end of the bridge is like story, dancing, drumming, breath work, building farms with each other, helping people raise, like a tribe of children for like a new world. But, I'm starting at the part of the bridge that I'm at.
yes. Thank you. That brings so much clarity, and like I really feel how aligned you are to that. And so, I just recently listened to one of your podcasts, which was the Aya recap. And bro, first of all, as a storyteller and as a autobiographical storyteller, very, very beautiful. Just very beautiful. Like I had some expectations of maybe what I was going to get into, and I was pleasantly surprised. And
Thank you.
so one thing that I heard in there is that from an early age, you were really seeking and found a path into nihilism, found a way to Nietzsche, and found a way to some of these other philosophers that really, man, it just really set your perspective on reality.
Yeah.
And so you can get to know a little bit about me, when I was 17, I read Celestine Prophecy, and then I
Mm.
read Ishmael, and then I read The Story of B. I was on this whole
Goosebumps. Yeah.
other thing where I was like being blasted wide open and super connected to the all, right? And so I want to know what that journey was, because I know there's so many brothers who feel that disconnection that we're speaking of, and you have that raw experience. So what is that like for 17-year-old version of yourself, basketball player version of yourself, really trapped in this, I think at one point you called it the chaos of eternity.
Yeah. So, um, the root of it is that I had a traumatic experience when I was about 7, where the first time that heaven, like the Christian heaven, was introduced to me,
Yeah.
um, it was introduced to me in a way where it's like, this is a really beautiful story, and this is what you get to look forward to if you live a good life. And I remember when I went home that night and I went to sleep, my brain tried to comprehend what forever meant. And I didn't have the words for it back then, but it was existentially dreadful. And it also felt like a betrayal by God in this weird way, where it felt like, because I only had my family dynamics and it wasn't great, like my parents did their best and it's not their fault. But the conception that I created was like I had to live this experience forever and that was the best possible outcome.
Yeah, that you would be in heaven forever with your loved ones, and at that time it's just your family, and it's
Right.
not that great. And in the same way of Groundhog Day or any sense
Right.
of perpetual eternity, that becomes hell.
And I would weep, and then I would, in this like sadomasochistic way, I would have to pray to the God that I thought was condemning me to this fate to help me forget so that I could fall asleep. And it went that way for about a week. And in hindsight, it took me many years to realize this, but I became like a zealot atheist, where I learned all the right argumentative, like cliches, and I would argue with anyone who would try to make any type of assertion that God was real or that God was good. And it brought me to a point where once my dream of basketball was ripped out of me, when my shoulder ripped out of its place, I had this existential pocket for about 5 years where I was trying to justify my life through Western philosophy, which is a fucking dead end. And
Why is it a dead end? Just out of curiosity, for those who are on that path right now.
yeah. So without getting too lost in the weeds, there is a branch of Western philosophy that believes that the way that you can know the world is through formal logic. And there were these two philosophers about 80 years ago that they were like the titans in the field, and they spent like 5 years writing a super long book called The Principles of Mathematics, where they were trying to logically prove that math was absolutely true or objectively true. And just to give you a sense of what that book was like, I think there was like a 34-page proof about why 2 + 2 = 4. And all the philosophers at that time were very excited for this book. It came out. And then a couple of months later, this unknown mathematician named Gödel, Godel, wrote an essay called The Incompleteness Theorem, where he proved that any logical system at some point must reference itself, so that there are assertions within the model that can never be proved. Therefore, logic is not fundamentally logical. And it might not make sense to people who aren't super into philosophy, but that killed the meaning in my life.
It kind of cracks the brain.
100%.
Once you hit that dead end, once you hit that wall, it's like
Yeah. And most people who grew up in Western culture, there's this weird implicit sleight of hand that the religion of our time is science. Yet most people don't know how to think in the spirit of science, which is fundamentally to question. And so we have something that's like a scientism. And most people who pretend to be smart, or who their sense of worth is that they're logical and scientific, almost none of them actually do science, but they follow what they believe is science. And the worldview that comes from science that is dominating in our culture is you're the byproduct of chance in a fundamentally uncaring universe. God is not real. And the way that that gets into our health model is you're essentially like a biological car. And if something breaks down, it's just because your user instructions or the manufacturer like blueprint was just fucked up, aka your genes, and you can't heal yourself. And if something's wrong with you, we have the parts or we have the pills. And if your shit's fucked up, it's not because our culture is sick. It's
Right.
not because our environment is sick. It's not because we're meant to be wild, but we're domesticated like zoo animals. It's not any of that. It's just because you're broken and take these pills for the rest of your life. And all of that is able to flourish because the story underneath it is that there is no God. There is no intelligent evolutionary process that's trying to guide you like the seed becoming an oak tree. It's not because our culture is sick. It's just because of chance. And we have the pills for you.
The way that we're trending is also a dead end. It's not sustainable,
All,
and
all
it's
you have
and
to do is look at the statistics for we are the most technologically advanced in recorded history, and we are the most chronically ill, both mentally and physically, that we've ever been. It's not working.
and is there some truth to the possibility that it always happens that way? Maybe for civilization to advance to such a point, there's a trade-off.
100%.
You know
And
what I'm saying? Maybe it's a part of the natural crystallisis and the chaos, of that eternity of being in the chrysalis, like that's also eternity, and it's necessary. It's a necessary part of this thing. And so the what you're on and what Sacred Sons and what Fit for Service are on is kind of like this news story, right? But before we get there, I just want to know, what is that journey? So like you hit your wall, you're cracking, you're like what you have built, your perspective on reality has been cracked. Where do you go from there, and how?
yeah, so a book came into my life that saved my life, and it's called Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. And the gist of it is um, he was a philosopher. He was very into science, but he also got into psychedelics. And the trickster archetype was very alive in him. And he wrote a beautiful book called Prometheus Rising that was scientific enough where I could respect it, but he was hinting at the fundamental mystery that lays at the center of existence that science or that scientism ignores. And it started to bring me into a experiential confrontation with the fundamental mystery. And then I started to really get into Carl Jung. And it was Carl Jung's philosophy that um, was the bridge for me between a scientific nihilism and what is now like it's like a felt knowing that there is a living, pulsing, collaborative mystery that seems to be alive, especially if you choose to run the hypothesis that it is alive. And that um, with the grace of a few mind shattering synchronicities, which is also a concept that was formalized by Carl Jung, um, it opened me up to beginning to at least develop a part of me that could grow alongside the very rigid skeptic that for the last 8 years I've really cultivated like it's a plant, and now it's this great tree in me that I've never gotten fully rid of the skeptic, because I actually think he serves as a good member in my inner kingdom, but he's not on the
Yeah,
throne anymore. And if I ever
powerful.
And if it ever gets to the point where he's on the throne, I've got other parts in me that can check his ass and get him off the throne again, because he's a great advisor. He's a
Yeah.
terrible king.
Yeah, that inner critic becomes the inner colonizer. So you definitely don't want him on the throne.
That's a good point.
Here's a question that came to me while you're speaking. When is the first time that you admitted to yourself that magic is real?
Great question. Okay. So in college, thanks to the magic of podcasting, I got exposed to at least the idea. Like, if you grow up in empire consciousness, especially in the 90s, I was under the impression that psychedelics were for burnouts and hippies, and that, if you did it, it would make you go insane.
Yeah.
And then the first podcast I ever listened to was by two people I'd never heard of, and it was Joe Rogan and Aubrey Marcus. And they were talking about this thing called ayahuasca, which I had never heard of. And it being my first podcast, it was the first time I heard men talk who weren't either factory workers or people who were in the army. Like, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, and the only men I knew were basically men who took orders and who hated their lives. And this was the first time that I heard men talk who loved what they did, and what they did was what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And it gave me permission, but it also exposed me to the first time to psychedelics. And so then I started reading some books, and I got really into, like, I'm going to do psychedelics as a way to explore my consciousness. And I don't recommend to people to do it the way that I did it, but I did quite a few psychedelics, like every weekend for a couple of months. And I was still an atheist. Like, after I did all those experiences, I was still like, this is all stuff being created by my brain. It's really cool, and it's teaching me things.
So, and just as a reader, were you getting into Terrence McKenna? Were you starting to pull some of the stuff from Rogan, right? And like invest that into your consciousness?
Terrence McKenna, Alan Watts, John Lilly. Yeah. But the book that really inspired me to test it on myself was a book called Pi Call, written by Sasha Shulgin, who was a chemist who invented something for the company he worked at that made them so much money, where they basically gave him a free pass to study whatever he wanted. And he was such a good chemist that he actually got license from the DEA to synthesize other psychedelics, and he would test it on him and his friends. And reading that book inspired me to start to do that to myself. So I do that for a couple of months, and I have a bunch of awesome experiences, but I'm still an atheist. And then a couple of months after I started that, I was walking around my neighborhood one day, and I had this habit where I would read books while I walked for a few hours, because I was just reading as much as I possibly could. And I was reading this book in the middle of summer in a residential area, where I got to a chapter that started with a quote, and the quote was something like, "The way to walk the world like a prince is to cast golden apples for other people to eat, and for you to finish your apple on your deathbed." And I was like, that's a cool quote. And as I read that quote, I was turning onto a street, and so I looked up, and in the middle of the street, there was no one who had just gotten back from a grocery store in their driveway, and there were no apple trees anywhere. In the middle of the street, there was one of those apples that have like shades of red and gold, and the part that was facing me was all gold. And I was completely sober when this happened. And it ruptured my skeptic in a way that the LSD and the DMT and the mushrooms didn't, and in a way that arose in me like gnosis. It wasn't a thought, it was a knowing. Magic is real. I don't understand it, and my scientific worldview is useful in a small domain, but it will never capture whatever this moment is right now. And that was the first time where I was like, magic is real. And I still get goosebumps when I feel back to that. Like, I
Yeah.
still have that book that I read, and on that page, I had a pink highlighter, and the page is just, you can feel my ecstatic excitement. Cause like, I fucking wrote notes and I started, cause it felt like the living intelligence, its giggle finally pierced the
Yes.
armor that I had
Yes.
created to protect the boy in me that experienced that
Mm.
trauma when I was 7.
Phew. Powerful. And it couldn't be more mythological. Like that it was an apple. I mean,
I
not
know.
only the origin of man, an apple, but also the apple that hit Newton in the head. You know, the apple of our iPhones. You know, the apple is so
Wow, I never thought about that.
cosmically. I mean, bro, you probably have an apple in your pocket right now,
Yeah.
or on your desk. You know, the apple is so cosmically linked in that silly, playful way. Like, oh, we're just gonna drop an apple on the head of like the genius embodied of the time,
Wow.
you know, to explain gravity. Anyway,
Great
so it
reflection.
could not be a more mythological moment, and I love that. And I guess my question from here is, from that moment, did you allow more magic to permeate? Were you able to continue sourcing in a way that brought you closer and closer? And where are you now?
Yeah, so I'm stubborn as fuck. And yep.
But I guess we should, I mean, I don't want to fast forward the story too much, but here you are in the present. You have now sat in ceremony with Aubrey, with Aya, I imagine.
Yeah, 100%.
And this has come to full fruition. I mean, this must be a part of the cosmic joke that you were listening and downloading these human beings, and here you are in the presence of that ceremony, which inspired you on this path.
That's a really good point. Again, I haven't really connected it like that, and I really appreciate that reflection. The way I conceptualize my inner world, because I'm so inspired by Jung, is like I see, like I have an inner council, and I have like an inner castle, and I have like a inner landscape, and I won't go too deep into it because it would take a long time to explain.
We can get as archetypal as you want to get here. Sacred
Oh yeah,
Sons know their archetypes.
beautiful. Okay, so one of my favorite books about archetypes is King, Warrior, Magician, Lover.
Of course.
And what's interesting is the way most people who know me perceive me is as if the magician is my major archetype. But what's interesting is in my internal world, and this is a very aptly timed podcast, it's that the magician is the least developed archetype in my inner knowing. And the way it's always presented itself to me is like it's a person with a hood over their face, and I can't see what their face looks like. I've deeply developed my king and my warrior and my lover, and I've got some other parts. I've got my inner child. I got like my intellect is like this big wolf. And my fear used to be Schmeagol from Lord of the Rings.
Gollum.
Gollum. But then after I did
Exactly.
But then after I did some work on him, he's now transformed, and now he's this like big, goofy black dog. Like I don't shame him anymore. And when I shamed my fear, it represented as like Gollum. But as I did some work, now it's this big, goofy dog who just will bark at the wind, blah, blah, blah.
Well, let me jump in here around the magician.
Yeah.
You know, I interpret the magician as the synthesizer of vision. You know, let's I like to lay it out like this. We all have this inner warrior. It's very easy to contemplate what a warrior is, even in modern terms. The warrior is the illuminator of boundaries.
Yep.
The warrior is out front, like holding the line. Behind the warrior is the lover, is that inner boy, is that inner boy. The inner boy is the essence of who we are, the essence of the soul that we are. And that is the purpose of the warrior, laying down those boundaries to protect him. And so your magician, your wizard, or whatever, however you want to envision that part, that piece, that man, that cape, that faceless man, Faceless Man, another dope myth. But synthesize the vision that you have to bring people together. I'm just saying again, so we can meet the problems that we're facing.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that's what needs more harmony, so that we can bring this into the world, because we need you, Erick. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And so it's actually been this year that I've done the most work on bringing the magician more fully into my inner counsel. And what I realized was the magician is my most potent archetype. It's the one that for me has the most capacity.
Yes.
And that I can feel that there's this really cool idea in Jungian psychology that where your dharma is the largest is the part of you that you'll have the most resistance to trying to uncover, but it prepares you for the fullness of your dharma. And like my radical skeptic was my inner critic suppressing my magician. And that in that ayahuasca experience that you read about in that story, one of my big recoveries was recovering my inner trickster, the part of me that laughs at ideology, the part of me that laughs at the people who pretend to know. And I had to actually go alchemize a core wound that I had when I was a child regarding a time that I laughed at my mom and it really hurt her. And I was able to liberate that. And the moment I did, the archetype that popped out spontaneously, and you know it's a genuine download when it surprises you and you start to laugh, was Rafiki. My favorite movie growing up was The Lion King. And I completely forgotten about Rafiki. And the moment I alchemized the suppression of that inner laughter by moving through the shame that I felt as a kid, Rafiki came out. And the Fit for Service event that I just got back from, 10 days ago, the theme of it was called Bringing Light to the Shadow. And I'm sure you experience this with your events, but whatever the theme is that we choose for the next event, there's this reciprocal, magical container where whatever the theme is, it starts to work on the coaches in their personal life.
Absolutely.
And so
it's once you call it in, once you conjure that energy, you're in ceremony.
100%. And what I realized at the event was the part of my shadow that I liberated at that event was my magician. And the hood came off. And it's Rafiki.
Nice.
Of course. Of course it is.
Yeah. Because there's so much wisdom in that playfulness. There's so much wisdom in the coyote and the trickster.
Yep.
There's so much wisdom in the trickster. To even in this case, in Rafiki's case, facing the end of a lineage, and he still had to go into his depth, into his shadow, if you recall.
I do.
But he never, maybe he did lose it for a minute, but the light never went out.
Right.
Because he sensed it. It was like the light never went out,
man. And so for me personally, and like the vision for my future is that one of the things that came through in that same ayahuasca experience was that what I truly desire to be is what I call an alchemist. And what I see as an alchemist is the mental rigor of what we admire in the West as the scientist, but the embodied gut and heart of like what the shamans of old were like. And that what an alchemist is, because like most intellectuals in the West, when you look at them, you can almost feel that they're like dried out, that there's something energetically about them where they feel like they don't have like the living pulse of nature in them, and that it's like
so true,
and that it's all up here.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of like shamans and just like spiritually attuned people where like they have the full aliveness, but at least for me, they don't have the mental rigor in a way where they can talk to most of our brothers and sisters who are still under empire consciousness in Western culture. And the way that I see it, and I really think that this is why the plant consciousness has like exploded forth into Western culture, is that it's almost like the intelligence of the plants and many of these still living indigenous cultures, they know the animal on the savannah that we have to flip is Western culture. If you imagine all of these cultures are like animals in an eco field, the one causing the damage that if this one is not flipped, it will kill all of us, is this apex predator that is Western consciousness. And it's like they're trying to bring all of their healing to this thing to flip it. And I feel like I'm a chakruna or a bridge to a lot of the people that pull the levers of this Western culture organism. And that for me, the integration of my magician is to like bring this philosopher and skeptic that I've cultivated for like 20 years and merge him with like the living heart of like a Rafiki. And my vision is that like this new psychology would be like a revivification of what the alchemists were trying to do, you know, hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. I mean, when I hear that, I feel like the bigger flip is when and this is projection, when you have a story to tell that is so powerful that all of the alchemy resides within it.
100%. Yeah. And there's almost this feeling of like, I accept my personal story of crucifixion, where a story will arise that will be my story to tell, that will be the transmission that my unique expression in this life will be able to give. What's interesting is I really feel like the new story that wants to come through me will not be complete until I've fully experienced what it feels like to be a father. Because an interesting thing to feel into is that we have almost no cultural heroes in our mythology that is current. Like there's no superhero who's really a father.
Right.
And what's interesting,
they all have father wounds.
100%.
It's the exact opposite.
And they don't have kids.
That's the society that it's created. Our mythology created that reality and continues to perpetuate it.
And the really like a really interesting thing to that I play with is that the myths of a culture are like the dreams of the individual. And where you can track the myths of our culture is where the most creative energy is put into modern stories. And for me, I think if you're paying attention, where we're trying to work out our modern myths are with our superhero movies. Right. And like the artistic nature is trying to work out what our new stories are. And if you track the evolution of our Marvel movies as like one great story that has been told, more human energy has been put into those stories and more human awareness has paid attention to those stories than any set of stories other than the biblical stories in recorded history in the West.
Wow. Never thought of that. Yeah. That's powerful.
And what's wild is as soon as our top god in those stories, which is Iron Man, as soon as he got a family, he died. He sacrificed himself for the next generation. And one of the things that I've been playing with is when the Marvel superheroes were first made, the king was an immigrant god, which was Superman. He was an immigrant. He came from some other land.
An alien. Yeah.
Right. Like, and that's literally the word that we use for people who are foreign. But when this new iteration of the Marvel stories came out, the collective consciousness chose Iron Man. And if you think about Iron Man, what makes him super is that he uses his mind to create armor to separate himself from the world. And that is the story of our time right now.
And he has a superficial form of power in the place of his heart.
Exactly. He has technology.
He has technology in place of his heart, bro.
Right. And then I'm getting goosebumps now, but his story arc, and I actually see this as a sign of hope, is that the unconscious collective artistic process evolved his story where he finally healed the shards of poison in his body, which I think are grief and shame, where he finally got his real heart. But to get his real heart, he lost his armor. You know, like in his personal 30 stories. And then once he had children, he finally was able to make the Jesus act, which is, I will sacrifice myself for the good of the next generation. And I think there's something in that story that if it were illuminated more properly, we could start to set the stage for the next stage of the stories of our culture, the myths of our culture. And I think that there's something about me personally becoming a father and being able to tell stories from fatherhood. Like the new set of stories for men, I think, need father consciousness. Like, let us be the alchemy of the father wound that we all inherited.
Absolutely. And let us be the men who return the father archetype to this planet in our lifetime now, because the father has been removed from the mythology, not only in our comic books, like across all platforms. The father is, God is like far away, some distant place, and you know, we have to be good so we're good enough for him to come back. It's like the father has been promoted as some absent source that we have no access to yet. The sun still rises every day. We still feel the warmth of the sun every single day. And so these stories that we tell ourselves, the myths that make us are important, and the myths that make men are important. And it's important for us to return the father, not only through the mythology, but in our presence every day as good fathers, as great dads, as good husbands, you know, as leaders.
100%.
And it looks all different ways, you know what I mean? So I feel you, man. I have 3 boys, 8, almost 3, and almost 1.
Beautiful.
And the journey of fatherhood has unlocked my heart more than any experience that is possible in life.
Yeah.
Truly. And it continues to allow me to like become who I am becoming. And so, you know, blessings on your journey. And does that mean Caitlin's having a baby? Is this what I'm hearing, or is it not yet?
Not yet, but it's absolutely in the works.
Okay. I'm just making sure I got all the info.
100%.
All
And
right. So
I
go
think,
ahead.
yeah, just real quick, that fundamentally, Bachelor consciousness is one generation deep. And I
Yeah.
think what our time needs is for the adults, even if you don't have children, to mature into the next stage of developmental consciousness, which is parental in its essence, which is multiple generations into the future deep. And that we're at a time where the next couple of generations are going to have to face the biggest problems that humanity has ever faced. And I really see that we are like, quote unquote, the people of the passage, where it's almost our responsibility to create the stories and set the examples of what it would mean to like mythologically create an arc, like ARK, for the next couple of generations to go through the flood that is very likely coming.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel, I believe that we all feel it in some sense. And the reality is that none of us are getting out of this life without a fight. So get some tools, get some
100%.
community, get some good people around you, get some good reflections. It's time for that. And yeah, this is cool, man. I'm just thinking, like, even in right now in popular culture, there has been a moment where fathers were brought back into the consciousness. One in particular is when Kobe died. When Kobe Bryant died with his daughter, he was immediately remembered as a girl dad, as a father, before a basketball legend. I'm getting chills right now as I'm saying it. But this is like, I mean, like the way reality works, the way that we perceive it. Like these are the gods and the prophets and the stories of our time. And so one of our greatest warriors, one of our greatest athletes, a beloved icon who had faults that were public and deep shadows, he was remembered as a father. That shit's real. And now we got The Rock, and now Jason Momoa, the warriors of our time, like embodied physically, showing up as dads.
Yeah.
And like the real superheroes. Fuck what Aquaman is, you know. That was a story written in the 60s by dudes who were high. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are the real men. These are the real men, and we need more men stepping up and being like, leading with their hearts, like, yo, I'm a protector, and I'm here for my children, and I'm here for not only my beloved or my woman, but for all women and for all children. It's like we don't have to just be fathers. And Stephen Jenkinson, one of my teachers, brilliantly states, become a father to everyone else's children but your own. And it's until you're a dad, it may not even land. It may not even land. But as men, like, we need to return that father archetype to our daily, to our culture. Yeah. So I feel that in you calling that in. And okay, I wanted to say this, and we'll wrap it. I'll give you a one on the out. I just looked up the meaning of your name. I don't know why, but I was like, I want to know kind of like what this name etymologically or kind of historically means. And what I came up with is Godsey comes from Godfrey, which means God's peace. And Erick means forever ruler or eternal ruler. Well, Erick Godsey, the forever ruler of God's peace, not of chaos, not of confinement, not of hell, but of God's peace. That is the superhero that I'm looking at right now.
I really appreciate that. And what's been really interesting for me is most cultures that were connected to having initiatory experiences, a part of the initiatory experience is often that the man would claim a new name once he became a man. That the name that he was given was the name of him as a child and a dependent. And that the name that he is given by his male peers after the initiation is the name that he has as an adult. And for me, there's a living intelligence that happens when you commune with ayahuasca. And
yes,
I've sat with her 13 times now, and the reclamation has actually been to step into my name. And that I had this moment where I was purging. And as I was purging, which is when most of the best downloads come, I was just really connecting to my name, God see. Yeah. God see. And it feels like one of my callings is to be able to see the gods of our time, these myths.
Yes.
And that it almost felt like I was from Game of Thrones, one of the Night's Guard that sits on the top of the Night's Watch and looks out into the abyss and waits for what's coming.
Yeah.
And that it's so interesting how there's this felt sense of fate, especially with our names, and that it's really just this year that it feels like I've really stepped into owning the responsibility of my name. And so I appreciate that reflection.
From Dr. Manhattan to the king at the wall. It's like, and that wall is like that wall that you hit and you're standing on it now. And you're like flagging in the others, like, hey, something's coming on this side. Like you're on top of that wall, dude. Like I see it. Like, listen, you have in my world view, you have this association with mythology. And so I'm just really feeling into the mythological story that it actually is your story. You know what I mean?
These are absolutely incredible reflections. Thank you. Yeah.
It's one of my gifts, bro.
I feel it. I feel it.
No, I'm also one who sees God truly in others and in myself and in all my relations. And it wasn't without the help of plant medicines and brotherhood and sisterhood and community and the love of my parents and my grandmother specifically.
Yep.
But yeah, for whatever reason, I am also here to see God in others. And I do believe that if we can do that, and if we can connect to our hearts, that's step one.
Yeah.
If we can connect to our hearts, we can really shift this planet. We can really shift human culture. We can really tell maybe a new old story in a good way.
Yeah, the word that resonates with me is let's retell the ancient future.
That's what our album is called.
Let's
Sacred
go.
Sons. Dude, we're dropping an album 11/11/2022, Sacred Sons. It's a compilation of 12 artists that are from our community. Sacred Sons, Ancient Future. The album drops 11/11/2022. Erick, this has been really deep. I told you we were going to get deep today. I just had a feeling. We're just going to go in. Thank you for showing up with all of you. With that, is there anything that you would like to leave with the brothers and sisters who are listening?
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to tell a story.
Yeah, let's go.
So Plato wrote a magnum opus called the Republica, where he attempted to philosophically outline how to create a civilization that would work. And at the end of that long work, the last chapter, he tells a myth, and it's called the myth of It's ER. And the myth goes like this. There was a great warrior that the gods saw were good, and they gave him a gift when he died, that he would be able to see what happens after we die, and he would be resurrected in 9 days, and it would be his obligation to tell the people what he saw. So he died in battle, and he went to what he called the middle world. And in the middle world, there's 2 judges, and on the side of each judge is a gateway. One gateway goes to the upper world, and that's what we would call heaven. And the other gateway goes to the lower world, and that's what we call this reality. The souls are judged when they die about whether or not they need to acquire more wisdom. And if a soul is chosen that it needs to acquire more wisdom, it has to go to the lower world. And if a soul has earned enough wisdom, it gets to spend a generation in the higher world. The thing about the higher world is that there's no suffering. And so souls that go there after a full generation, they lose some of their wisdom. And so when they come back, they'll eventually have to go to the lower world. And so with each great churning, there's a group of souls that arrive in front of these judges. And the ones that are chosen that they don't need to acquire wisdom, they get to go up to the upper world. The ones that are chosen that they have to acquire more wisdom, they go down a river to this temple where the goddess of fate sits on a rainbow throne. And all the souls that arrive at that goddess, there's a bunch of golden threads placed in front of the throne, and they get into a line and they go up and they get to choose one of these golden threads. The golden threads are different fates that they would have to live out in the lower world to acquire wisdom. Once you choose your fate, you then have to go in a cavern underneath the throne to the river of forgetting, because the weight of your fate is too heavy to bring into a body. So you drink from the river of forgetting so that you can forget, but then the goddess of fate gives you a guardian angel or a guardian spirit who remembers your fate but doesn't get a body, but it will live with you in your body. And that's where the word daemon was introduced into Western culture. And then you go out into your life and your daemon will guide you. Socrates was dubbed the wisest man in Athens because he only listened to his daemon. And his daemon would only tell him what not to do. And it eventually led to him being killed because he was charged by corrupting the youth. But basically what it was is he would argue with the wisest people in Athens and he would embarrass them publicly by questioning them over and over and over again until it was clear that they didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. I believe that that story is true. And I believe that we have a spirit inside of us that is trying to communicate with us to help us live our dharma. And a really interesting thing to think about is you don't get to choose what you're interested in.
Yeah.
You don't get to choose who you admire. You don't get to choose who you fall in love with. You get to choose how you respond to those feelings, but there's something in you that you don't have control over that grabs things and pulls them to you. And I think that's your daemon. And I think ultimately the greatest guide in your life will be learning how to communicate with that daemon. And I personally believe that all of our mental disorders are actually different ways the ego resists the daemon. And that I have a dream of rewriting the diagnostic and statistic manual as like a book of magic, where these disorders are actually different types of callings that the daemon brings to the ego. And that the ego is like the shell of the seed. The ego resists being broken. But if you trust the daemon, you'll trust your rupturing. And you'll be able to offer the collective your unique dharma that we so desperately need. And so my invitation to people is try the hypothesis that all of your wounds and all of your suffering and all the things that you've been told by Western culture are disorders are actually created by you and for you to bring you more towards who you're supposed to be, which is your dharma.
Step into your dharma. And I think I heard you say this, your daemon, it will, if you acknowledge it, if you lean into it, it can build your kingdom, or it can destroy you.
If a daemon ignored becomes a demon.
Yes. And I've also heard you say this: go to the dragon. Don't wait for the dragon to come to you. And so that's what I see you doing. That's what I see you doing in the work that you're bringing to your community. We need you. Just like I said from the top, we need you. So thank you for picking up your banner and for being on this mission that you are on.
Thank you so much, brother.
Yeah, see you, bro. With that, I'm going to go pick up my sons from school and make sure Hannah's doing okay. I'm fully in it. You prayed for fatherhood, and in sacred son circles, we always say, like, be careful what you pray for, because it's coming.
100%.
That fatherhood, like, it's all beautiful and everything too. It's also coming, and there's a daemon that's coming with that too.
Yeah.
Truly. Amen. So thank you. Dude, I would love to see you at a Sacred Sons event. I'm sure our paths will cross. I know you've kicked it with Albert as well. So yeah, in time.
Absolutely.
Look forward to seeing you in the flesh.
Thank you, brother.
All right. With that, Erick Godsey, Fit for Service, The Myths That Make Us. Check out the podcast. Adam Jackson, Sacred Sons, Route Family. Peace.